This is the relation between your apps and Sentry.io, which has a lot going on to process your events. But there's only 4 things that you should focus on because they affect whether an event is accepted or not, and ultimately how your quota is utilized. And you can adjust each of these yourself. Filtering and data scrubbing can be performed from within the SDK in your app as well, so let's start there. We saw earlier how to initialize Sentry. We have some additional options we can pass here for filtering and data scrubbing. For instance, there's a callback function called before send that you can pass to this initialization constructor. And you could do this for any of our SDKs. The function is invoked when the exception is thrown and includes the event object that Sentry puts together for you, which includes the exception. You can inspect it, and then based on anything you like or dislike about it, you can return null and the event will be discarded. It will not be sent onward to Sentry.io. Or you can transform the data you see on it, and this can serve as a form of data scrubbing, in which case you would still return the event so it gets sent to Sentry.io. And you can do the same for breadcrumbs, which does the same thing conceptually. Just return null if you want to ignore the breadcrumb, or you can transform something on that breadcrumb and then return it so it still gets recorded. Let's see what other options we have. There's a whole list of configuration options, and we recommend you review it at some point, but let's look at blacklist and whitelist URLs for now. With these, the SDK can discard the events for you based on the URL from which the error was thrown. This is good for ignoring errors thrown by third-party JavaScript libraries that were downloaded into your app. Just put the URL of where that library was loaded from. Another technique you can use involves your loggers in your application. Configure your loggers to send to Sentry or not based on the log level of that error. Be sure to check if Sentry already offers integration for your logger, like we do with Java and Python, among a few others. If there's no Sentry integration, then go to the configuration for your logger and instrument Sentry there. So if there is a Sentry integration, then this invocation of your logger will send this to Sentry. And if we don't have an integration, then just go to where you initialize your logger, and there should be some kind of config or middleware so that you can instrument Sentry. What you would instrument is this method here, sentry.captureException. So then in every catch block, for instance, that your logger is used, this Sentry method will get called as well. Now that we've seen how to filter and data scrub from within the application, let's move on to the server side and see the first thing that acts upon your events as they hit the server, and that's rate limiting. So open up your project settings and click on Client Keys DSN. Then click Configure for your key. A rate limit is a way to cap the amount of events accepted during a time window. So here, I'm accepting at most 5,000 within an hour. Anything beyond that will get dropped. You can generate a DSN key for each test, staging, or prod environment, and then control the rate limit separately for each of those. And you can also disable a key at any point in time and then enable it later. If you're wondering for how to set your rate limit, then we recommend setting up Sentry for your app and see what your event volume is over a 7 or 14-day period without a rate limit. If the rate limiting is happening, you could always come back here and you'll see what events were accepted, and anything that was rate limited will be in red and will say rate limited here. So let's take a larger view of our data, let's say past 30 days. Then find your highest spike in volume in this time period. So if I click and zoom in here on this spike, and then I want to set my rate limit whatever the peak of this spike is, for how many events happened within this time range. So I would go back to the DSN configuration and then set my rate limit based on what I'm seeing here. If you set your rate limit too low, then you run the risk of not being able to tell when your app is actually having a problem, as you'd have more of a flat graph curve here. You'd be dropping events and you wouldn't know how many users are being impacted. And when your users are being impacted, you want to be able to see what those events were and not be dropping them. The server side, since we've already seen it on the application SDK side, as well as rate limiting. So go to your project settings, where you have a dedicated section called Inbound Filters. There are some easy ones you can turn on here, but let's look at custom filters. You can filter by release, which is a version of your code, and we'll talk more about releases in the next section. If you had a buggy release that's been fixed, but customers are still accessing that version of your app, then you can ignore its errors here by putting the release number. You can also filter by error message. In this example here, I put the error type followed by the error's message. And this supports the wildcard character, so you only have to put part of the error message. And if that event keeps coming in and the message is slightly different, then as long as it matches here, it'll get filtered out. So let's take a look at the issue in Sentry that I took this example from. So this issue here happened 2 times. This was the error type, and this was the error message. And I'm just making the match on this part of the message, and then I put a wildcard, so it doesn't matter what the text is after here, it will get selected by the filter. This is useful because sometimes the only difference in your error message is an ID or URI or a piece of SQL syntax, and if it's different every time, then that'll create multiple different issues in your dashboard. So let's compare this inbound filter on error message to another feature we have called delete and discard. Delete and discard also sets a filter for you, but it's based on a full match of this error message, so it's not going to apply to as many use cases in the future. Whether you use the error message filter in inbound filters or delete and discard, this event will not happen a third time. It'll hit our ingestion layer and we will drop it. It will not get persisted and stored nor count towards your quota. So now, let's talk about data scrubbing. We have a dedicated section in our docs on security and privacy. And you can also find this at the project level. Right now, we're at the organization setting level. So you can turn on regular data scrubbing here. And if you have additional sensitive fields, then you can list them here. So this brings up the question, what are the default fields getting scrubbed? Well, they're listed in our documentation here. So if there's anything additional, you can put that in this field. You can mark fields as safe as well if they're getting scrubbed by accident. And we have another feature called advanced data scrubbing. If you don't see this section here, then go into your general settings and click the button for enable early adopter features. So with advanced data scrubbing, you choose what is the field that you want to scrub out, and then what do you want to do with the value for that field? Do you want it to be replaced with a hash or masked with stars or removed altogether? And another useful option in here is custom regex. So let's say you have a field coming in on one of your events and it's something like patient name. Well, then you can put a regex here that covers many different ways that the phrase patient name might be written, whether it's patient dash name, patient underscore name, capital N, lowercase n, and so forth.
Now let's see how aggregation works and how we can use this to clean up what we're looking at in our dashboards and have a more manageable issue stream. I'll give an example of how to customize aggregation from the SDK side, and then we'll look at how to do it through some settings on Sentry.io. Let's review first how aggregation works. So these events that happened 2.5 thousand times got grouped together into the same issue. So let's think about why that happened. Well, it's because each of these events shared the same fingerprint, which is something that Sentry uses to uniquely identify the events and group them together into the issue. Sentry uses a combination of the stack trace, the error type, and the error message to set this fingerprint. So let's take a look at how we can alter this fingerprint from the SDK side and then see that from the server side. So one way you can do it in the SDK, if you recall that before send callback that we worked with earlier where you initialize the SDK, you can update the fingerprint on certain events of your choosing. So maybe you have some events coming in and they're causing 10 different issues and you'd rather have all those issues get grouped together into the same single issue. Well, look at anything on that event and try to decide that they're the item of interest here. So for instance, maybe they're all for a database connection error. So if you can identify that using the event or this hint object, which Sentry provides, it has additional context and info about the exception, then set the fingerprint as database connection error. Therefore, all the events that were an instance of this database connection error will have the same fingerprint, and you'll have one issue instead of those 10 issues. So you could identify this based on maybe something in a tag or a stack trace or anything at all in the event. Another way you can do it, rather than use before send, you can go into your app source code. For instance, here we're setting the fingerprint not on the stack trace, we're not letting it be that by default. We're saying that whenever there's an HTTP request, that if there's an error, then we want to set the fingerprint based on whatever the method on that HTTP request was, as well as the path and the error status code. So then rather than having multiple different issues, you can now merge some of those together by setting the same fingerprint for them based on the method, path, and error status code. So you can really use anything for your own judgment here. So now let's look at how to do this through Sentry.io and some settings that we have. So we have a guide on it here and some info you can review again about what the fingerprint is. Let's take a look at how to do merging for issues that have already come in, whose events have already been accepted. And then we'll look at how to set rules for incoming events in the future. So for one, if you have lots of issues and they only vary slightly by something like the message here, check them off and click Merge. Also, you can open up a single issue and Sentry will give you suggestions for issues that are very similar and why. And then you can check them off and hit Merge as well. And finally, let's look at server-side fingerprinting. So in this case, you might have some issues coming in that are the same error type, and the message is the same for each except for something like a URL name, the host name. So in this case, you can set a rule where we're saying this was the error message. It starts with safe HTTP connection pool, and the host equals star. So now any issue that has this message in it, that starts off with this text string here, these will get grouped together because they all get the same fingerprint set for them, which is connection timeout type. And if you look at our documentation, you can see that you can group by more than just the message. You can do on type, message, value, function, and path of the file.